Queen stands before a line of prisoners, her emerald eyes cold as winter stone. She's buying slaves for her castle, a transaction she's performed dozens of times without feeling. But when her fingers brush the iron collar of the seventh prisoner, something stops her. His hands. Those elegant, scarred hands that seem impossibly familiar in a way that makes her chest tighten without explanation. She buys him anyway, this broken, silent thing with a mutilated face and no voice. She doesn't recognize him. How could she? Her son drowned 10 years ago. They never found his body, but she buried an empty coffin because grief demanded closure. The young prisoner is led away in chains, his storm-gray eyes holding a truth that would shatter kingdoms. He knows exactly who she is. He remembers her perfume, her laugh, the way she used to kiss his forehead goodnight. He's been searching for her through years of torture and slavery, and now he stands in her castle, owned by his own mother like cattle. But he can't tell her. They cut out his tongue 3 years ago. And in the shadows, the man who orchestrated everything watches with calculating eyes, already planning how to ensure the lost prince dies before the truth destroys 10 years of carefully constructed lies. In 72 hours, a wooden toy will surface that shouldn't exist. A birthmark will be revealed that only a mother would recognize, and a queen will have to choose between the laws that bind her crown and the son she thought she'd lost forever. But the man who stole her child once is still pulling strings from the darkness, and this time, he won't fail. The iron collar bit into his neck as Queen Isolda's fingers traced the edge of the metal, her emerald eyes cold and calculating. She didn't see a human being standing before her in chains. She saw a tool, a broken silent thing to scrub the blood from her castle floors. The young man's head hung low, his matted hair covering most of his face, but his hands trembled violently at his sides, not from fear, from the effort of keeping them still, from stopping himself from reaching toward the woman who had once kissed those same hands goodnight, who had once called him her greatest treasure, the woman who now owned him like cattle. The morning air in the castle courtyard carried the stench of unwashed bodies and desperation. 12 prisoners stood in a ragged line, their wrists bound, their futures decided by the whims of nobles who barely glanced at them. Isolda moved down the row with mechanical precision, her silk gown whispering against the cobblestones. She had done this ritual dozens of times since her husband's death 5 years ago. The kingdom demanded strength. Weakness invited invasion. So she bought prisoners from the southern wars, put them to work, and never allowed herself to feel anything about it. Feeling was a luxury queens couldn't afford. But when she reached the 7th prisoner, something made her pause. Her personal guard, Captain Aldous, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, perhaps not this one. He's damaged, mute, possibly mad. The scars suggest severe torture. He might be more trouble than he's worth." Isolda's jaw tightened. She hated when Aldous presumed to know her mind. Her eyes swept over the young man again. He was perhaps 22 or 23, tall but unnaturally thin, his body bearing the roadmap of suffering. Burns traced patterns across his exposed forearms. His left ear was partially missing, but it was his hands that held her attention. Long fingers, elegant despite the grime and scabs. Artist's hands, scholar's hands. Hands that seemed impossibly familiar in a way that made her chest constrict without explanation. "How much?" she asked the slave trader, her voice sharp enough to cut. The merchant, a fat man with wine-stained teeth, grinned. "For this one? 50 silver coins, Your Majesty." He can't speak, but he understands commands. Quite obedient, actually. Broken in. "Properly, if you know what I mean." Something hot and vicious flashed through Isolda's stomach. She despised this man, despised all of them. But she needed the laborers, needed the economy of war, needed to keep her kingdom functioning while vultures circled her borders. 30, she said flatly. "Your Majesty, he's young, he'll last years of..." 30, or I move to the next. The merchant's smile faltered. "Done, Your Majesty. A pleasure doing business with the crown." As coins exchanged hands, the young prisoner finally lifted his head. just for a moment, just long enough for Isolde to see his eyes. They were the exact shade of storm gray that she saw every time she looked at the portrait in her private chambers. The portrait of her son, her Theron, dead these 10 years, drowned in the river during a midnight ambush when he was only 12 years old. They never found his body. She had screamed herself voiceless for 3 days straight. Her hair had gone from chestnut to silver-streaked within a month. The prisoner's eyes held hers for 3 heartbeats. She saw something in them that made her breath catch. Recognition? No. Impossible. Grief played tricks. She saw Theron everywhere in those first years, in every dark-haired boy, in every child's laugh echoing through the castle. Her mind was simply doing it again, finding phantom sons in strangers' faces. She turned away abruptly. Take him to the lower kitchens. He'll work the scullery until we assess his usefulness. Captain Aldous hesitated. Your Majesty, there's something odd about him, the way he looks at you. Perhaps we should... I don't pay you to speculate, Captain. I pay you to follow orders. Her voice cracked like a whip, and Aldous bowed stiffly. As the guards led the prisoners away, the young man stumbled. His legs, weak from weeks in a cage, nearly gave out. Isolde's hand moved instinctively, reaching out as if to steady him, before she caught herself and let it fall back to her. Sighed. A queen didn't touch slaves. A queen didn't show weakness. But in that fraction of a moment, the young man had seen it. That aborted gesture of concern. And as he was dragged through the castle gates, his broken lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of someone who had just confirmed a devastating truth. Someone who had just recognized love buried under years of ice and duty and survival. In the shadows of the courtyard's eastern colonnade, Lord Gregor. Vasilis watched the entire exchange with narrowed eyes. The Queen's chief advisor, the man who had steered the kingdom through its darkest hours, felt his pulse quicken with something close to panic. He had been 17 different places that morning, checking 17 different loose ends. But he hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected the ghost to walk right through the front gates. His mind raced through calculations. The boy couldn't speak. Good. But he could write, could gesture, could find ways to communicate if given time. Time was the enemy now. Gregor had spent 10 years building his power, positioning himself as indispensable to the grieving queen. He had plans, alliances, a proposal of marriage drafted for exactly the right political moment. All of it crumbled if the lost prince returned from the dead. He would need to be careful. Isolde trusted him completely, but she wasn't stupid. Any obvious move against a random prisoner would raise questions. No, this required subtlety. An accident, an illness, something that would remove the problem before it grew teeth. Gregor smiled coldly and turned toward his private chambers. He had poison that mimicked natural disease. He had servants who owed him unspeakable debts. And he had the advantage of being the only person in the castle who knew exactly what he was looking at. The only person besides the mute prisoner who couldn't scream for help even if he wanted to. The scullery reeked of rancid fat and rotting vegetable. Scraps. Theron's hands plunged into water so scalding it raised fresh blisters on his already ruined skin, but he didn't flinch. Pain had become a language he understood better than words. He scrubbed copper pots with methodical precision, his mind cataloging every detail of the kitchen, every face, every routine. The head cook, a massive woman named Bertha with forearms like ham hocks, had looked at him with something close to pity before assigning him the worst tasks. Pity was dangerous. Pity made people ask questions. He kept his head down and worked in silence, which wasn't difficult given his mutilated tongue. The soldiers who'd captured him 3 years ago had taken his voice the same day they'd taken everything else. They'd wanted information about rebel positions. When he had nothing to give them, they'd made sure he could never speak again. The irony was almost beautiful. The lost prince of the realm struck mute, invisible in plain sight within his own mother's castle. Across the kitchen, a young scullery maid named Elise watched him with curious brown eyes. She couldn't have been more than 16, with flour dusted across her freckled nose and a tendency to hum while she worked. "You got a name?" she asked during the midday meal, sliding a bowl of thin broth toward him. The other servants had already taken their portions and scattered to corners, too exhausted to socialize. Theron looked at her, then at the broth. He hadn't eaten anything but moldy bread in 4 days. His stomach cramped with hunger, but his hands remained still. Trust no one, especially not kindness. Kindness always came with strings attached. Elise sighed. Right. You can't talk. Sorry. She tapped her temple. Not quite thinking straight today. Long night. The queen had another nightmare. Whole castle heard her screaming. Happens every few months like clockwork. Always the same thing. She cries out for someone named Theron. The wooden spoon in his hand snapped. The crack echoed through the kitchen like a breaking bone. Elise jumped, her eyes widening. Theron stared at the 2 pieces of wood in his grip, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. He'd heard his mother scream his name in her sleep. After 10 years, she still called for him in the dark. The weight of that knowledge pressed against his ribs like an iron band. Hey, you all right? Elise leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You look like you've seen a ghost. He forced himself to nod, forced his hands to unclench, forced his face back into the blank mask he'd worn for so long it had become his real face. But Elise had seen the crack in his armor, and her expression shifted from curiosity to something more complicated. Concern mixed with wariness. She'd recognized that he was more than he appeared. That was a problem. Before she could speak again, Captain Aldous strode into the kitchen, his polished boots clicking against the stone floor. You, mute. He pointed at Theron. The Queen. Wants the private study cleaned. 3rd floor, West Tower. Bertha, send him up with supplies. Bertha's thick eyebrows rose. The private study? Captain, that's unusual. We have regular maids for... The Queen specified the new prisoner. Aldous' tone left no room for argument. Apparently he's literate. She saw him reading the marking on the grain sacks earlier. Thought he might be useful for organizing her father's old manuscripts while he cleans. Theron's heart hammered against his sternum. His mother's private study. The room where she kept her most personal possessions. The room where, if memory served, she'd once kept a small wooden horse he'd carved for her 13th birthday. He'd burned his initials into the bottom. If that horse still existed, if she'd kept it all these years, it might be a way to show her the truth without words. But it could also be a trap. Lord Gregor Vasilis had been watching him during the prisoner selection. Those cold, calculating eyes had lingered. Too long, assessed too carefully. If Gregor suspected who he was, sending him to an isolated tower room would be the perfect opportunity for an accident. A fall from a window, a sudden illness, a tragic mistake with cleaning chemicals. Aldous was still staring at him, waiting. Theron had no choice. He nodded and stood, accepting the bucket of supplies Bertha thrust into his arms. As he followed the captain through the castle's winding corridors, his mind raced through possibilities and dangers. The stone walls around him held fragments of his childhood. He'd run through these halls barefoot, laughing, chasing the castle cats. Now he walked them in chains, a stranger in his own home. They climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs. Aldous said nothing, but his hand rested on the pommel of his sword. Finally, they reached a heavy oak door with iron hinges. The captain produced a key and unlocked it. You have until sunset. Don't touch anything you're not cleaning. Don't break anything. Don't even think about stealing. I'll be checking on you. He pushed the door open and gestured for Theron to enter. The room was exactly as Theron remembered, yet completely transformed. The walls were still lined with shelves, but where there had once been his grandfather's military histories and his father's collection of poetry, there were now ledgers, tax records, military reports, maps marked with troop movements and defensive positions. His mother had turned her father's sanctuary into a war room. The massive oak desk was covered in correspondence, each letter stamped with wax seals from different noble houses. She was holding the kingdom together through sheer force of will, and the evidence of that struggle filled every surface. But in the corner, on a small table near the window, sat a wooden box, dark cherry wood, carved with roses. He knew that box. His father had made it for his mother on their wedding day. Theron's hands shook as he set down the cleaning supplies. He glanced back at the door. Aldous had left, his footsteps fading down the stairs. Alone. He was alone for the first time since entering the castle. He moved toward the box like a man approaching a cliff edge. His fingers brushed the carved roses, tracing patterns he remembered watching his father create. The latch opened with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in silk cloth, was the wooden horse. Small, crude, the work of a 12-year-old boy who'd been more enthusiastic than skilled. But she'd kept it. Through war, through grief, through everything, she'd kept it. Theron lifted the horse with trembling hands and turned it over. There, burned into the base in a child's uneven letters, were the initials TV Theron Vasilis. Wait, Vasilis. His blood turned to ice water. Vasilis was Gregor's family name, Lord Gregor Vasilis, his mother's chief advisor. But Theron's family name had been Lockhart, after his father, King Edmund Lockhart. Unless his mother had remarried, unless Gregor had somehow convinced her to take his name, to bind their houses, unless Gregor had been positioning himself to claim the throne through marriage. The door behind him creaked open. Theron spun around, his heart exploding into his throat. Lord Gregor stood in the doorway, his expression pleasant and terrible at once. In his hand was a small vial of clear liquid. "Hello, boy," Gregor said softly, closing the door behind him with a gentle click. "We need to have a conversation. Well, I'll talk. You'll listen. And then you'll drink this and go to sleep. Forever." Theron's back pressed against the bookshelf as Gregor advanced into the room, his footsteps deliberate and unhurried. The vial caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, the liquid inside refracting into tiny rainbows that seemed obscene given what it represented. Death in a pretty bottle. Gregor's smile never reached his eyes, those calculating gray stones that had been watching the kingdom's strings for a decade. "You know, I almost didn't recognize you at first," Gregor said conversationally, as if they were discussing weather patterns instead of murder. "The scars really did a number on that pretty princeling face, but those hands gave you away. Your father had the same long fingers, and the way you looked at her, like a starving dog staring at meat. Desperation has a very particular smell." Theron's mind raced through options. The window was 3 stories up. Even if he survived the fall, he'd break both legs and be caught within minutes. The door was blocked by Gregor's body. There were no weapons within reach except books, and Gregor wore a dagger at his belt that he clearly knew how to use. The wooden horse was still clutched in Theron's left hand, his knuckles white around it. Gregor noticed and laughed, a sound like gravel scraping against glass. "Ah yes, the little toy. She keeps it like a shrine, you know. Takes it out every year on the anniversary of your death and just stares at it for hours. Crying. Always crying. It's actually quite pathetic. The great Queen Isolde, reduced to weeping over a chunk of wood." Rage burned through Theron's chest, hot and vicious. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Gregor saw the fury and his smile widened. "There he is. There's the fire. I wondered if they'd beaten it all out of you in those prison camps. Apparently not." He moved closer, backing Theron further into the corner. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drink this poison. It's quite elegant, actually. Mimics a heart condition. You'll feel chest pains, collapse, and be dead within the hour. The castle physician, who happens to owe me several significant favors, will declare it a pre-existing ailment. Tragic, really. Young man survives war only to die from a weak heart." Theron shook his head violently, his hands coming up in a warding gesture. His mouth opened uselessly, no sound emerging except a wet, strangled rasp that barely qualified as breath. The frustration of voicelessness crashed over him like a wave. He had so much to say, so much to scream, and all that came out was silence. "Oh, don't bother trying to communicate," Gregor said dismissively. "Even if you could speak, who would believe you? A nameless prisoner claiming to be the dead prince? They'd assume you were mad. Isolde would probably have you executed herself for the insult to her son's memory." He uncorked the vial, and the sharp scent of almonds filled the air. Bitter. Almonds. Cyanide derivative, probably. Fast-acting. Painful. But Gregor had made a mistake. He'd gotten too close, too confident in his control of the situation. Theron's years as a prisoner had taught him that survival wasn't about strength. It was about recognizing the single moment when your enemy's attention wavered. And Gregor, in his arrogance, had just glanced toward the door as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Theron moved. His arm swung in a wide arc, the wooden horse still, clutched in his fist, and connected with the side of Gregor's head. Not hard enough to kill, but enough to stagger him. The vial flew from Gregor's hand, hit the stone floor, and shattered. The liquid hissed as it spread across the ground, eating into the spaces between the stones with a faint sizzling sound. Gregor roared in fury, his hand going to his dagger, but Theron was already moving toward the door. His malnourished body protested every movement, muscles screaming, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He grabbed the door handle and yanked it open just as Captain Aldous appeared on the other side, his hand raised to knock. Aldous' eyes widened. What in the seven hells is going on here? Behind Theron, Gregor straightened, his hand falling away from his dagger. His face transformed instantly from murderous rage to concerned confusion. The shift was so smooth it was terrifying. Captain, thank the gods you're here. This prisoner just attacked me, completely unprovoked. I came to check on his progress and he went mad, started throwing things. Look at the mess. Aldous' gaze swept the room, taking in the shattered vial, the liquid eating into the floor, Gregor's reddening temple where the wooden horse had connected, and Theron's wild-eyed panic. The captain's expression hardened. Step away from Lord Gregor, prisoner. Now. Theron's stomach dropped. He looked between Aldous and Gregor, his mind scrambling for any way to communicate what had actually happened. But how? Could he? He couldn't write fast enough, couldn't gesture clearly enough. And even if he could, why would anyone believe a mute slave over the Queen's most trusted advisor? He did the only thing he could think of. He thrust the wooden horse toward Aldous, then pointed desperately at himself, then at the horse again. His hands moved frantically, trying to convey identity, connection, truth. But Aldous just looked more confused and increasingly angry. Lord Gregor, what is that he's holding? Aldous asked, his hand moving to his sword. Gregor's eyes gleamed with malicious intelligence. It appears to be a toy that belongs to Her Majesty. He must have stolen it from the box on that table. Captain, I believe we're looking at a thief as well as an attacker. The Queen will be devastated. That horse was carved by her son before he died. Theron wanted to scream, wanted to tear the world apart with the injustice of it. Instead, he clutched the horse tighter to his chest and shook his head. So violently his vision blurred, Aldous drew his sword halfway. Put down the toy, prisoner. Last warning. The sound of silk against stone came from the stairwell. A woman's footsteps, quick and purposeful. Queen Isolde appeared behind Aldous, her face flushed from climbing stairs rapidly, her emerald eyes flashing with irritation. Captain, what is this commotion? I could hear shouting from 2 floors down. I have ambassadors arriving within the hour and I need... She stopped, her gaze locked onto the wooden horse pressed against Theron's chest, clutched in his scarred hands like a talisman. All the color drained from her face. Her lips parted, and for a moment she looked exactly like she had 10 years ago when she'd learned her son was missing. Devastated. Shattered. A woman watching her world end for the second time. Where did you get that? Her voice came out as barely a whisper, rough and broken. Theron's eyes filled with tears he'd thought had dried up years ago. He held the horse out toward her with shaking hands, and the gesture was so achingly familiar that Isolde took an involuntary step backward. Her son used to offer her things exactly like that, hopeful, desperate for approval, wanting so badly to make her smile. Your Majesty, the prisoner stole it, Gregor interjected smoothly. I caught him red-handed going through your personal effects. When I confronted him, he became violent. I recommend immediate punishment before he causes more damage. But Isolde wasn't listening to Gregor. She was staring at Theron's hands, at the way his left thumb curved slightly inward, at the small scar across his right knuckle from when he'd cut himself learning to carve, at the impossible, heart-stopping familiarity of those fingers wrapped around wood. Isolde's hand rose to her throat, fingers pressing against the pulse point there as if trying to keep her heart from escaping through her skin. The silence in the room stretched like pulled thread, fragile and ready to snap. Her eyes traced every line of Theron's face, searching through the scars and damage for something she'd lost a decade ago. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible, that grief was playing its cruelest trick yet, but her body recognized what her mind refused to accept. Mothers knew their children in ways that transcended logic. "Let me see your wrist," she said suddenly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Your left wrist." Gregor stiffened. Almost imperceptibly, Aldous looked confused but didn't lower his sword. Theron hesitated for only a heartbeat before extending his left arm, pushing back the filthy sleeve to reveal scarred, dirt-encrusted skin. Isolde stepped closer, her breathing shallow, and her fingers touched his wrist with a gentleness that made Theron's entire body shudder. She turned his arm, searching, and then she found it. A birthmark, crescent-shaped, dark as spilled wine, nestled in the soft skin below his thumb. Exactly where her son's had been. The wooden horse slipped from Theron's right hand and clattered to the floor. Isolde's knees buckled. She would have fallen if Aldous hadn't caught her elbow, his face now pale with dawning comprehension. "Your Majesty, this cannot be. Prince Theron drowned. We searched for weeks. There was no body, but the river." "There was never a body," Isolde interrupted, her voice gaining strength even as tears began streaming down her cheeks. "We assumed. We buried him. Empty coffin because I needed closure, but we never found him." Her gaze locked onto Theron's face, searching, pleading. "The scar on your knuckle. You got it when you were 11, trying to carve a wolf figurine. You were so frustrated you threw the knife and it bounced back and cut you. I bandaged it myself while you cried and said you'd never be any good at anything." Theron nodded frantically, tears now pouring down his own ruined face. His hands moved to his chest, pressing over his heart, then reaching toward her in a gesture that was pure instinct. The same gesture he'd made as a child when he wanted to be held, when nightmares woke him, when the world felt too big and frightening. Gregor's mask finally cracked. "Your Majesty, I must protest this fantasy. The prisoner is clearly disturbed and—" "Shut your mouth." Isolde's voice cut through the air like a blade, cold and absolute. She didn't even look at Gregor. Her entire focus remained on Theron, drinking in every detail as if she could fill the 10-year void through sight alone. "That birthmark is identical. Those hands are his father's hands. And this—" She bent and retrieved the wooden horse, cradling it like a holy relic. "He carved this for me when he was 12, burned his initials into the bottom. TV Theron Vasilis." She paused, her expression hardening. Except his name was never Vasilis. It was Lockhart. Theron Edmund Lockhart. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Aldous' hand tightened on his sword hilt as he turned toward Gregor, understanding blooming across his weathered features. "Lord Gregor, why would Her Majesty just refer to the prince using your family name?" Gregor's composure returned like a shield snapping into place. "A simple slip of the tongue, Captain. Her Majesty is clearly in shock, confused by this prisoner's manipulation. He's likely been studying the royal family, learning details to exploit. It's a common con among— I never told anyone about the wolf carving incident," Isolde said quietly, each word deliberate and lethal. "It happened in my private chambers. No servants present, just myself and my son. No one else alive knows that story." She finally turned to face Gregor fully, and the look in her eyes would have made lesser men flee. "Which means either this is truly Theron, or you're about to explain how a random prisoner could possibly know intimate details of my son's childhood." Gregor's jaw worked. His hand drifted toward his dagger, a tiny movement that Aldous caught immediately. The captain's sword came fully free of its sheath with a sharp ring of steel. Don't even think about it, Lord Gregor. Your Majesty, perhaps we should secure the advisor while we sort through this situation. But Isolde was already moving past them all, closing the distance between herself and Theron until she stood directly before him. Up close, she could see the damage more clearly. The burns that had melted parts of his face, the missing chunk of ear, the way his jaw sat slightly wrong, as if it had been broken and healed poorly. And his eyes, God's, his eyes still held that same desperate need for approval, that same fierce intelligence, but now they were wrapped in layers of trauma so thick she could almost touch it. "What did they do to you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Her hand rose toward his face but stopped just short of touching, afraid she might hurt him, afraid he might disappear like morning mist. "My baby, what did they do?" Theron's mouth opened. That awful rasping sound emerged again, wet and painful. His hand went to his throat, and he shook his head. The gesture was clear. He couldn't tell her, couldn't explain. The words were locked inside him forever. Fresh rage ignited in Isolde's chest, burning away the shock and grief. Someone had stolen her son. Someone had tortured him. Someone had cut out his tongue and left him voiceless. And then someone had hidden him in plain sight, let her buy him like an animal, let her treat him like a tool. "Who did this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Who took you? Who kept you from me?" Theron's eyes shifted toward Gregor, just for a second, but it was enough. Gregor laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Oh, this is rich. The mute prisoner can't defend himself with words, so he'll simply point fingers at whoever he dislikes. Your Majesty, think rationally. I have served this kingdom faithfully for 15 years. I was at your side through your husband's death, through the invasion attempts, through every crisis. Why would I possibly harm the prince?" "Because you wanted the throne," Aldous said slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind. "You've been positioning yourself as indispensable. Always the one with solutions. Always the one the Queen trusts most. Marriage proposals rejected year after year, but you kept trying. Because if the prince was dead, you were next in line through your distant royal blood. And if you married the Queen..." "Speculation and paranoia," Gregor snapped. "Captain, you forget yourself." But Isolde was no longer listening to either of them. She was remembering. The night Theron disappeared, Gregor had been the one to suggest the midnight patrol route. Gregor had insisted the young prince needed to start learning military strategy firsthand. Gregor had argued with Edmund about it for hours until the king finally relented. And Gregor had been conveniently delayed from joining that patrol, arriving just minutes after the ambush, just in time to report the tragedy. "You sent him into that ambush," she said, her voice deadly calm. "You planned it. You made sure he'd be there and you wouldn't." "Prove it," Gregor challenged, his veneer of civility finally shattering. "You have no evidence. Just the manipulations of a mute con artist who probably studied royal history in whatever prison spawned him. You're seeing what you want to see because you're weak. You've always been weak, Isolde. Your husband knew it. That's why he kept you away from real decisions. And that weakness is why this kingdom has been falling apart under your rule." The slap came so fast no one saw it coming. Isolde's palm connected with Gregor's face with a crack that echoed off the stone walls. "Aldous, arrest this man. Charge him with treason, conspiracy, and attempted murder of the crown prince. Lock him in the deepest cell we have." Gregor's hand went to his dagger, but Theron was faster. 10 years of survival. Instinct kicked in. He lunged forward, tackling Gregor around the waist, and both men crashed to the floor. The dagger skittered away. Aldous moved in immediately, his boot coming down on Gregor's wrist with enough force to make bones creak. The castle dungeon smelled of rust and human misery, a scent Theron knew intimately from his years in captivity. He stood outside Gregor's cell 3 hours after the arrest, his body still trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Isolde had insisted he rest, eat, bathe, but he'd refused everything except water. He needed to be here, needed to see the man who'd stolen his life locked behind iron bars. Gregor sat on the stone bench inside the cell, his fine clothes already rumpled and dirty. but his posture remained defiant. When he saw Theron approaching with Aldous, his lips curved into something too bitter to be called a smile. "Come to gloat, princeling? Or has your mother finally realized her mistake and sent you to release me?" Aldous' hand moved to his sword. "You don't speak unless spoken to, traitor." But Theron held up a hand, stopping him. He'd asked Aldous to bring him here for a reason, and it wasn't to listen to Gregor's venom. He pulled a piece of parchment from his pocket, along with a charcoal stick that Isolde's personal scribe had provided. His hands shook as he began to write, the letters uneven and childlike after years without practice. When he finished, he held the parchment up to the bars where Gregor could read it. "Why didn't you kill me that night?" Gregor's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been regret or might have been irritation at his own mercy. "Because you were 12 years old and screaming for your mother. Because even I have limits, apparently. Foolish limits, as it turns out." He leaned forward, his eyes hard. "I paid the mercenaries to take you far away, to sell you somewhere you'd never return from. They were supposed to take you across the Eastern Sea. How in the seven hells did you end up in the southern war zones?" Theron wrote again, his movements sharp and angry. "They sold me to slavers who sold me to an army that needed bodies. I spent 5 years carrying supplies. 3 years in a prison camp after our side lost. They thought I was a spy because I wouldn't talk." "Wouldn't or couldn't?" Gregor asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, as if they were discussing weather rather than torture. Theron's hand went to his throat. He opened his mouth and pointed inside, where the mangled stump of his tongue was visible in the torchlight. Aldous turned away, his face gray. Even Gregor flinched. "Gods, I never ordered that, for what it's worth." The rage that surged through Theron was so intense he couldn't breathe for a moment. "For what it's worth." As if that absolved anything. As if knowing Gregor hadn't personally wielded the blade made any difference. He grabbed the bars of the cell with both hands, pressing his face between them, and the sound that came from his ruined mouth was pure animal fury. Gregor didn't look away. "Hate me all you want, boy, but understand something. I did what I did because I love this kingdom. Your father was a weak king, more interested in poetry and philosophy than defending our borders. Your mother, for all her current strength, was lost in grief and nearly let everything collapse. I held this realm together. I made the hard decisions. I secured alliances. I built the army that's kept us safe. Was the price high? Yes. But it was necessary." Aldous spoke through gritted teeth. "You murdered the heir to the throne and call it necessary? I removed a child who would have grown into another weak king." Gregor corrected coldly. "Look at him now. Even if he could speak, he's broken, damaged. What kind of king could he possibly be? The nobles would eat him alive. The kingdom needs strength, not a traumatized mute who flinches at shadows." The words hit Theron like physical blows, because part of him, the part that had survived by becoming small and invisible and silent, believed them. He was broken. He did flinch at shadows. He woke up screaming silently from nightmares every night. What right did he have to rule anything? But then he remembered his mother's face when she'd recognized him. The way she'd looked at him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. The way her hands had trembled when she'd touched his wrist. She hadn't seen a broken thing. She'd seen her son. And maybe that was enough to start rebuilding from. He wrote again, the letters fierce and large. "You're wrong. I survived things you can't imagine. That makes me stronger than you'll ever be." Gregor read the words and laughed, but it sounded hollow now. "We'll see, princeling. We'll see what happens when you try to take your place at court. When the nobles who've grown comfortable with their power see you as a threat. When they whisper about your scars and your silence and question whether you're truly fit to inherit. Your mother can claim you all she wants, but proving it to the realm, that's another matter entirely." Aldous stiffened. "What are you implying?" "I'm implying that a birthmark and childhood stories aren't enough for a royal succession claim," Gregor said smoothly. "The law requires testimony from multiple witnesses who knew the prince before his disappearance. It requires physical proof of identity that goes beyond a mother's. Desperate hope. And most importantly, it requires the approval of the noble council, half of whom owe their positions to me. Theron's stomach dropped. He hadn't thought about the politics, hadn't considered that recognition from his mother might not be enough. He looked at Aldous, whose grim expression confirmed Gregor's words. He's right, Aldous admitted reluctantly. Noble succession law is complex, especially after someone's been declared legally dead for a decade. The council will need to convene. There will be challenges, tests, questions. He paused, his discomfort visible. And Lord Gregor does have significant influence among the nobles. Many of them believe the kingdom has prospered under his guidance. So even from a cell, I still win, Gregor said softly. Because the moment your mother tries to restore you to the succession, I'll make sure every noble house in the realm knows about your condition, about your inability to speak, to command, to rule. They'll demand alternatives. They'll push for your mother to remarry someone strong, someone like, say, my younger brother. Family loyalty runs deep, Princeling. Even with me imprisoned, the Vasily's name still carries weight. The realization crashed over Theron like ice water. Gregor had built a system where his removal didn't matter. He'd spread his influence so thoroughly through the nobility that the damage would persist even with him gone. It was brilliant and horrifying in equal measure. Theron's hands clenched on the parchment, crumpling it. His mind raced through possibilities, through strategies, through ways to fight this. But every path seemed blocked. He couldn't speak to defend himself, couldn't command respect through words, couldn't argue his case before the council. He was exactly what Gregor said he was, a broken, silent ghost trying to reclaim a life that no longer fit. Aldous placed a hand on Theron's shoulder. Come, Her Majesty is waiting for you. She's ordered a feast prepared. The entire castle staff is being told tonight that the prince has returned. Whatever happens with the council, you're still her son. That's what matters. But as they turned to leave, Gregor's voice followed them down the corridor. Enjoy your reunion, Princeling. Enjoy it while it lasts. Because tomorrow, the real battle begins, and you're walking into it unarmed and voiceless. I almost pity you. The words echoed in the darkness, and Theron couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, despite the arrest and the recognition and his mother's tears, Gregor was still somehow winning, still pulling strings from behind bars, still controlling the board while everyone else just moved the pieces. And the worst part was, Theron had no idea how to fight back. The great hall blazed with candlelight, hundreds of flames reflecting off polished silver and crystal goblets, but Theron felt cold down to his bones. He sat at his mother's right hand, dressed in fine clothes that hung awkwardly on his malnourished frame, acutely aware that every eye in the room was fixed on him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. Isolde had assembled the castle's highest-ranking residents for this announcement, and the tension was thick enough to choke on. His mother stood, her emerald gown shimmering in the firelight, her crown sitting heavy on her silver-streaked hair. She looked every inch the queen she'd become, but Theron could see the tremor in her hands where they gripped her wine goblet. My loyal subjects, she began, her voice carrying across the hall with practiced authority. Tonight I share news that I never dared hope to speak. My son, Crown Prince Theron Edmund Lockhart, has returned to us. Stolen as a child, lost for 10 years, but alive. He sits before you now. The silence that followed was deafening. No one clapped, no one cheered. They just stared at Theron with eyes that calculated and measured, and found him wanting. Finally, Lord Marcus Pemberton, an elderly nobleman with a snow-white beard and sharp black eyes, rose from his seat. Your Majesty, we rejoice at your happiness, but surely you understand our position. The prince was declared dead a decade ago. Legal precedents were established. Succession plans were made. We cannot simply accept this claim without substantial proof. Proof? Isolde's voice took on an edge that could cut glass. He bears the royal birthmark. He possesses knowledge that only Theron could have. He carries scars that tell the story of unimaginable suffering. What more proof do you require, Lord Pemberton? Lady Helena Blackwood, a woman in her 40s with calculating eyes and a mouth like a knife wound, spoke up from across the table. "With respect, Your Majesty, birthmarks can be duplicated with dye. Private knowledge can be extracted through torture or manipulation. We've all heard tales of con artists who study noble families and exploit grieving relatives. Given the implications for the succession, we must be absolutely certain." Theron watched his mother's knuckles turn white around her goblet. He wanted to stand, to defend her, to rage at these people who looked at his mother's joy and saw only political inconvenience. But he couldn't. His silence made him invisible even sitting in plain sight. Lord Pemberton nodded gravely. "The Council proposes a series of tests, historical questions about the castle, the family, events from the prince's childhood. Physical examinations by multiple physicians to verify the birthmark's authenticity, testimony from servants who knew the young prince. These proceedings would take approximately 3 weeks to complete properly." "3 weeks?" Isolda's voice rose. "You would make my son prove his identity like a criminal on trial? We would make certain that the crown passes to its rightful heir and not an impostor," Lady Blackwood said smoothly. "Surely Your Majesty understands that we act in the kingdom's best interest. If this young man is truly the prince, he has nothing to fear from scrutiny." But Theron saw the trap immediately. 3 weeks of public examination. 3 weeks of nobles asking questions he couldn't answer aloud. 3 weeks of doctors poking at his scars and whispering about his fitness to rule. 3 weeks for Gregor's allies to plant doubts and build opposition. They were going to destroy him slowly, publicly, until even his mother questioned whether fighting for him was worth the political cost. He reached for the parchment and charcoal that Aldous had insisted he keep nearby. His hands shook as he wrote, the letters smearing slightly from the sweat on his palms. When he finished, he held it up for everyone to see. "I welcome your tests. I have nothing to hide. But know this. I remember every noble family that stood with my father. And I remember those who whispered that he was weak. I was 12, not blind. I heard everything." A ripple of unease moved through the assembled nobles. Several shifted in their seats. Lord Pemberton's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that a threat, young man?" Theron wrote again, faster now. "It's a memory. Whether it becomes a threat depends on whether you seek truth or political advantage." Lady Blackwood's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your Majesty, the boy has spirit. I'll grant him that. But this only reinforces our concern. A ruler must have diplomacy, must build bridges rather than burn them. How can someone who cannot speak possibly conduct the delicate negotiations that kingship requires?" The question hung in the air like poison. Several nobles nodded in agreement. Theron felt something crack inside his chest, a pain worse than any physical torture. Because she was right. How could he rule without a voice? How could he command armies, negotiate treaties, inspire loyalty? The mutilation that had been inflicted on him hadn't just taken his speech. It had taken his future. But then Isolde did something unexpected. She laughed. It wasn't a happy sound, but it was genuine, and it cut through the tension like a blade. "Lady Blackwood, you raise an interesting point. Let me tell you about diplomacy. For 10 years, I have sat in rooms full of men who believed themselves my superiors. Men who thought a grieving widow would be easy to manipulate. Men who saw my crown as something to be claimed through marriage or political maneuvering." Her gaze swept across the nobles, sharp and unforgiving. "And yet here I stand, the kingdom intact, our borders secure, our coffers fuller than they were under my husband's rule. I accomplished this not through honeyed words, but through action, through careful planning, through understanding that true power comes not from what you say, but from what you do." She placed her hand on Theron's shoulder, and he felt the strength in her grip. "My son may not have a voice, but he has something far more valuable. He has survived. He has endured horrors that would have broken lesser men. He has learned patience, observation, and resilience. These are qualities that matter far more than eloquent speeches. Her voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "And I suggest you all remember that before you were whispering about succession laws and fitness to rule, you were subjects who swore fealty to the crown. That crown sits on my head, and I declare this man to be my son and heir. If you wish to challenge that, we can discuss the consequences of treason." The threat was clear and absolute. Several nobles paled. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty, no one questions your authority. We simply wish to ensure—" "Then conduct your tests," Isolde interrupted, "but you will do so with respect. You will address him as Your Highness, and you will remember that every day you delay is a day you insult your future king." She sat down, her hand still on Theron's shoulder, and the gesture was both protective and defiant. Theron looked up at his mother, seeing her truly for the first time since his return. This wasn't the woman he remembered from childhood. That woman had been gentle, often overshadowed by his father's presence. This woman was forged from grief and necessity into something unbreakable. She had become the ruler the kingdom needed, and she had done it alone. He picked up his charcoal and wrote 3 words on fresh parchment, then held it up for only her to see. "I'm so proud." Isolde's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Not here, not in front of the vultures waiting for any sign of weakness. Instead, she squeezed his shoulder once, a gesture that said everything words couldn't. Lord Pemberton stood again. "Very well, Your Majesty. The tests will begin tomorrow. We'll start with historical verification, then move to physical examination, and finally witness testimony. I trust that's acceptable." "It will have to be," Isolde said coldly. As the nobles began to file out, murmuring among themselves, Lady Blackwood paused beside Theron's chair. She leaned down, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. "I knew your father, boy. He was a good man, but a weak king. This kingdom cannot afford another weak ruler. If you truly care about your people, you'll walk away. Let your mother choose a stronger successor, someone whole." The first test came at dawn. Theron stood in the castle's archive room surrounded by 7 nobles, each holding lists of questions prepared overnight. Lord Pemberton presided over the proceeding with the gravity of a judge at an execution. Maps covered the long oak table, along with ledgers, family trees, and documents dating back 3 generations. The morning light filtering through the high windows felt accusatory, highlighting every scar on Theron's face. "We'll begin with castle geography," Pemberton announced. "Simple questions that any royal child would know. Where is the hidden passage that connects the Queen's chambers to the chapel?" Theron picked up his charcoal, his hand steadier than yesterday. He'd spent the entire night remembering, forcing his traumatized mind to reach back through years of survival mode to access childhood memories he'd buried for self-preservation. He wrote, "Behind the 3rd tapestry on the east wall, the latch is disguised as a rose carved into the wood paneling. My father used it to attend morning prayers without the servants seeing him in his night clothes." Lady Blackwood examined his answer with narrowed eyes. Anyone with access to castle servants could have learned this. "Then ask something only the prince would know," Captain Aldous suggested from his position by the door. He'd insisted on attending every test, his presence both protective and validating. Lord Pemberton consulted his list. "What gift did your mother give your father on their 10th wedding anniversary?" No servants were present for the exchange. Only the royal family. Theron closed his eyes, reaching for the memory. He'd been 9 years old, hiding behind the curtains in his parents' private sitting room because he'd wanted to see his father's reaction. His mother had been so nervous, her hands shaking as she presented the box. He wrote, "A compass made from melted-down coins from every kingdom they'd visited together during their courtship. The back was engraved with coordinates that marked the spot where he proposed. She was terrified he'd think it was silly." He cried. The room fell silent. Isolde, who'd been standing near the window trying to maintain composure, made a small sound. Her hand pressed against her mouth. "I never told anyone that," she whispered. "Edmund made me promise not to tell because he was embarrassed about crying." "How could you possibly?" Because I was there. Theron wrote quickly, his letters urgent now. I was hiding behind the green curtains. You found me after Father left and told me that real love makes people brave enough to show their feelings. You said I should remember that. Isolde turned away completely, her shoulders shaking. Several nobles exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even Lady Blackwood's expression flickered with something that might have been doubt beginning to crack. But Lord Pemberton pressed on, his voice harder now. Tell us about the day Prince Theron disappeared, every detail you remember. This was the trap question. Theron had known it was coming. They wanted to see if his story matched the official reports or if he'd been coached. His hand moved across the parchment, and the memories came flooding back with visceral clarity. The cold night air, the smell of horses and leather, the sound of his father arguing with Gregor about whether a 12-year-old should be on patrol. He wrote for several minutes, filling 2 full sheets of parchment. He described the route they'd taken along the river road, the way moonlight had reflected off the water like scattered coins. How? He'd been excited because his father had finally agreed to let him learn military strategy. He described the ambush in detail, 8 men emerging from the trees, their faces covered, their movements coordinated. The clash of steel, his father's voice shouting for him to run, the hands grabbing him from behind, being dragged toward the river, fighting, screaming for his mother, the cold water closing over his head, surfacing downstream, crawling onto the bank, hiding in the reeds while men searched for him with torches. I waited until morning, he wrote. I tried to find my way back to the castle, but I was lost, scared. A merchant wagon found me on the road. The driver seemed kind, offered food. I was so hungry. I didn't realize he was working with the men who'd attacked us until we were miles away, and he sold me to slavers. Lord Pemberton read the account twice, his expression unreadable. The official report states that Prince Theron's horse was found by the river with blood on the saddle. The assumption was that he'd been wounded and fell into the water. His body was never recovered because the current was too strong that night. The blood was my father's, Theron wrote, his hand trembling now. He cut his arm on a blade trying to protect me. Some of it must have gotten on my clothes when he grabbed me. I wiped my hands on the saddle when I was trying to mount the horse to escape. Aldous stepped forward. That detail was never in any report. We found blood, but never determined whose it was. King Edmund had already been treated for his wound by the time we examined the scene. We assumed it was the prince's. Because that's what Gregor told you to assume, Isolde said sharply, her voice raw but steady now. She turned back to face the room, her eyes red but dry. He controlled the investigation. He wrote the reports. He made sure everyone believed my son was dead. Lady Blackwood shook her head slowly. Your Majesty, I mean no disrespect, but Gregor's guilt doesn't automatically prove this young man's identity. A clever con artist could have interviewed survivors of that night, could have pieced together details from multiple sources. Then explain the Compass story, Aldous challenged. Explain private family moments that no one outside this family could possibly know. Torture, another noble suggested quietly. Lord Vincent Ashford, a thin man with gray eyes like winter sky. We know from his scars that he was tortured extensively. Perhaps someone extracted information from the prince before his death and fed it to this young man, trained him to impersonate. Theron slammed his hands on the table with enough force to rattle the inkwells. The sound cracked through the room like thunder. Every head turned toward him, and the rage in his eyes was so pure and incandescent that several nobles actually stepped back. He grabbed fresh parchment and wrote with violent, slashing strokes. My father's favorite poem was The Wanderer's Return by Cedric Blackstone. He used to recite the last stanza to me every night before bed. It was our ritual, just us. No one else was ever present. If I write those words now, and my mother confirms them, will that be enough? Or will you invent another excuse to deny the truth because admitting it means admitting you've spent 10 years supporting the man who destroyed the royal family? He shoved the parchment toward Lord Pemberton, then immediately began writing on a new sheet. His hand moved quickly, muscle memory pulling up words he hadn't thought about in a decade. When he finished, he held up the parchment for everyone to see. Beyond the mountains, through the storm and shadow, the wanderer finds the light of home. Not in grand halls or gilded thrones, but in the eyes of those who never stopped believing he would return. Love is the compass that guides us through darkness. Love is the anchor when the world becomes storm. Isolde made a sound like something breaking. She crossed the room in 3 strides and snatched the parchment from Theron's hands, staring at the words as if they were written in her son's blood. "These are the words," she whispered, exactly as Edmund spoke them, word for word. He changed the last line from the original poem because he said the published version wasn't romantic enough. She looked up at the assembled nobles, and her expression was fierce enough to burn. No one knew about that change. Edmund never wrote it down. It was his private modification, shared only with his son during bedtime. There is no possible way anyone could know this, except Theron. Lord Pemberton's composure finally cracked. His hands shook slightly as he set down his list of questions. "Your Majesty, this is certainly compelling evidence, but the council will still require the physical examination and witness testimony before." "No." Theron wrote the word so large it took up the entire parchment. He held it up, then wrote again. "No. More tests. No more proof. I have given you everything. I have opened my worst memories. I have shown you pieces of my childhood that I buried to survive. Either you believe me, or you declare yourselves enemies of the crown. Choose now." The noble council convened in emergency session that same afternoon, and the castle thrummed with tension so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. Theron sat beside his mother in the formal council chamber, a room he'd once hidden in as a child to watch. His father conduct business. The circular table that had seemed enormous to his young eyes now felt suffocating, surrounded by 23 nobles whose expressions ranged from grudging acceptance to barely concealed hostility. Lord Pemberton stood at the head of the table, his aged hands gripping a ceremonial staff that symbolized his role as council speaker. The evidence presented this morning was substantial, private family knowledge that no outsider could reasonably possess. However, before we proceed to a formal vote on succession restoration, there is one matter that must be addressed. He paused, his gaze moving to Theron with something that looked almost like sympathy. "Your Highness, the law requires that a crown heir be capable of fulfilling royal duties. Given your condition, the council needs assurance that you can effectively rule. We need to understand how you intend to govern without speech." The question wasn't cruel, but it landed like a blade between Theron's ribs. Every head turned toward him, waiting. His mother's hand found his under the table, squeezing tight enough to hurt. He could feel her silent plea, "Don't let them see you break." He reached for his parchment and charcoal, but Lady Blackwood's voice cut through the air before he could write. Lord Pemberton raises the central issue. A king must inspire troops before battle, must negotiate with foreign ambassadors who will see silence as weakness, must address the people during crisis. These are not optional aspects of rulership. They are fundamental requirements. She turned to Isolde, her expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, no one questions your son's identity anymore, but we must consider what is best for the kingdom. Perhaps Prince Theron could be restored to the royal family without assuming the succession. He could live comfortably, honored and protected, while you name a more suitable heir." "More suitable," Isolde repeated, her voice dangerously soft. "You mean someone who can speak, someone whole, someone who hasn't been broken by the very tragedy that this council's negligence allowed to happen." Lord Vincent Ashford shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, that's not fair. None of us knew about Gregor's treachery. We were deceived, just as you were." "Were you?" Isolde's eyes blazed. "Gregor spent 10 years consolidating power, making himself indispensable, positioning his family members in key roles throughout the kingdom. And none of you questioned it. None of you found it suspicious that the Queen's chief advisor gained so much influence after the heir's convenient death." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against stone. "You were complicit through your willful blindness. And now you have the audacity to suggest my son is unfit because the damage inflicted on him makes you uncomfortable." Theron tugged on his mother's sleeve, shaking his head. This wasn't how they'd win. Rage wouldn't convince the nobles. He needed something else. He began writing, his hand moving with purpose across the parchment. When he finished, he stood and held up the sheet for everyone to see. "You're right. I cannot speak. I cannot give rousing speeches or charm foreign dignitaries with eloquent words. But I can listen. I spent 10 years learning to observe everything because survival depended on reading people's intentions through their actions rather than their words. I know when someone is lying because I watch their hands, their eyes, the tension in their shoulders. I know when someone is afraid or angry or hiding something. These are skills most rulers never develop because they're too busy listening to their own voices." Lord Pemberton read the words carefully, then looked up. "An interesting perspective, Your Highness, but observation doesn't replace communication." Theron wrote again, faster now. "My mother built this kingdom's current strength without a husband's voice backing her. She learned to communicate through action and careful strategy. I learned to survive through the same methods. Together, we would be stronger than any traditional ruler because we understand that power comes from wisdom, not volume." Several nobles murmured among themselves. Lady Blackwood's expression remained skeptical. "Joint rule is unprecedented in our kingdom's history." "So was a queen ruling alone," Isolde countered. "So was surviving 3 attempted invasions while maintaining economic stability. So was holding a realm together after losing both a husband and son within 2 years. I have made a career of doing unprecedented things, Lady Blackwood. And I did it while half of you whispered that I was too emotional, too weak, too feminine to lead." Lord Ashford cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, no one questions your accomplishments, but the boy makes a valid point about joint rule. Perhaps that is the solution. The prince could be restored to the succession, but you would continue to govern actively until he's proven himself capable of ruling independently." It was a compromise, and compromises were how politics worked. Theron could see several nobles nodding, relieved to have found middle ground. But he could also see the trap. Until he's proven himself capable could mean years, decades, forever. They'd use his silence as perpetual justification to keep real power out of his hands. He'd be a figurehead, a puppet prince who existed to legitimize his mother's continued rule until she died, at which point they'd argue someone else should take over. He wrote again, his letters sharp and clear. "I don't want shared rule. I want what is mine by birth, but I understand I must earn your trust. So I propose this. Give me 1 year. 1 year to prove I can lead effectively. If after that time the council believes I'm unfit, I will voluntarily step aside and support whatever succession plan my mother chooses. But if I succeed, you will never question my fitness again." The room erupted into arguments. Some nobles thought it was reasonable. Others insisted it was too risky. Lady Blackwood called it political theater. Through it all, Theron sat quietly, watching their faces, reading their fears and ambitions and loyalties. He saw which nobles glanced at each other for guidance, revealing alliances. He saw who truly cared about the kingdom's welfare versus who simply wanted to maintain their own influence. He cataloged every detail the way he'd learned to catalog guard movements in prison camps. The way he'd learned to memorize which slavers were cruel and which merely indifferent. Finally, Lord Pemberton raised his staff, calling for silence. "The prince's proposal has merit. A trial period would allow us to assess his capabilities without permanent commitment. However, we need specific criteria for success. We need measurable goals." Aldous spoke up from his position by the door. "With respect, Lord Pemberton, the prince just demonstrated something crucial. While you were all arguing, he was watching, learning. I've served 3 monarchs in my lifetime, and I've never seen anyone read a room the way he just did. That's not something you can teach. That's instinct. Instinct doesn't negotiate trade agreements," Lady Blackwood snapped. "No, but intelligence does," said a new voice. Everyone turned toward the doorway where Elise, the young scullery maid from the kitchen, stood wringing her hands nervously. Behind her, 2 guards looked apologetic for letting her through. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but I had to speak. I worked beside His Highness in the kitchens. He couldn't talk, but he communicated just fine. He organized the whole scullery workflow in 3 days just through gestures and written notes. He solved a supply problem that had plagued us for months. The other servants started following his lead because his solutions actually worked." Lord Pemberton frowned. "And you are?" "Nobody important, my lord. Just a maid. But I know what I saw. That man is smarter than anyone I've ever met. Voice or no voice." Elise's courage seemed to grow as she spoke. "And if the nobles of this kingdom are too proud to see that, then maybe you're not as wise as you think you are." The audacity of a scullery maid lecturing the noble council should have been scandalous. Instead, an uncomfortable silence fell, because everyone in that room knew she was right. They were so focused on traditional measures of leadership that they'd forgotten what leadership actually meant. Isolde moved to stand behind Theron's chair, her hands on his shoulders. "My son has already proven himself in ways none of you have considered. He survived a decade of hell that would have killed most men. He found his way home against impossible odds. He faced his torturer with courage, and he stands here now, willing to earn what should have been his by right, because he loves this kingdom enough to accept your doubt." Her voice broke slightly. "He is twice the man most of you will ever be. And if you cannot see that, then this council has learned nothing from 10 years of Gregor's manipulation. Sometimes the people we've lost never truly leave us. They're out there, fighting through darkness we can't imagine, carrying our names in their hearts like sacred prayers." Queen Isolde bought a slave and found her greatest treasure. Theron survived a decade of hell and discovered that love could endure even when hope seemed dead. But their story asks us the hardest questions. What would you do if the person you loved most stood before you, unrecognizable and broken? Would you see past the scars to the soul beneath? And if you were Theron, voiceless and damaged, would you have the courage to fight for a life that no longer seemed to fit? This story isn't just about a lost prince. It's about every person who's been invisible, dismissed, or told they weren't enough because they didn't fit someone else's definition of worthy. It's about mothers who never stop searching. It's about the strength it takes to survive when the world tries to erase you. Theron may not have his voice, but he found something more powerful: the unwavering love of a mother who refused to let the world tell her what was possible. In the end, the greatest victories aren't won through speeches or swords. They're won through the quiet, relentless refusal to give up on the people we love. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the invisible people in your own life who deserve to be seen, then share it. Let someone else feel what you just felt. Hit that like button if you believe that broken things can still be beautiful, that silence can be more powerful than words, and that love is the only force strong enough to bring the lost back home. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that will make you cry, make you think, and remind you why being human matters. Thank you for listening.